On January 20th, 2025, Donald Trump declared that the United States would take back the Panama Canal. For decades, the canal felt like closed history, built by America, transferred in 1999, politically dormant ever since. So, why bring it back now? Is this campaign optics? Or a deeper fear that, in a war with China, America's fastest link between two oceans could become a strategic choke point? The canal cuts 16 days of naval transit. It carries nearly 40% of U.S. container traffic. In a Taiwan crisis, those 16 days could shape the first phase of a war. If that route were blocked or leveraged, the impact would be immediate. So, this isn't about the past. This is a matter of the present and the future. Why does Trump want the canal back? And what does that reveal about America's fear of losing control of its own mobility in the next great power conflict? To understand why the Panama Canal is suddenly back in the headlines, we need to start with what Trump is actually arguing. His case rests on three core claims. First, that the United States was foolish to give the canal away in 1999, that Washington surrendered a strategic asset built with American money, American engineering, and American lives. In this framing, the Carter-era treaties weren't strategic diplomacy. They were a historic mistake. Second, that American ships are being overcharged. The logic is simple and politically powerful. If the U.S. is the canal's largest user and once controlled it outright, why shouldn't it receive preferential treatment? But the third claim is the most consequential, that China is effectively controlling the canal, not merely investing in Panama, not merely expanding influence, controlling it. And when pressed on whether he would rule out military force, Trump did not categorically say no. That is the escalation point. Because for more than 2 decades, the Panama Canal has not ranked among America's top national security threats. It hasn't dominated Pentagon briefings, it hasn't driven election cycles, it hasn't shaped defense budgets. So why now? Why elevate a century-old waterway into a modern strategic flashpoint? This resurgence is not random, and to understand it, we have to go back. Not just to how the United States built and controlled the canal, but to why giving it up once seemed strategically acceptable, and why that calculation may be changing. In 1903, Panama was still a province of Colombia. When negotiations between Washington and Bogotá failed over canal rights, the United States threw its support behind a Panamanian independence movement. U.S. naval forces positioned off both coasts effectively prevented Colombia from retaking the territory after Panama declared independence. Within weeks, the newly formed Panamanian government signed a treaty granting the United States sovereign control over a 10-mile-wide strip of land across the isthmus, roughly 1,400 square kilometers, known as the Canal Zone. This was not symbolic oversight. It was full territorial authority in perpetuity. The strategic logic was blunt. Before the canal, the U.S. Navy had to travel nearly 13,000 miles around Cape Horn to move ships between the Atlantic and Pacific. That meant weeks of delay during crises. It meant fragmented fleets. It meant slower response times in war. The canal eliminated that constraint. By cutting transit time by roughly 16 days, it fused America's 2 coastlines into a single operational system. A fleet based in Norfolk could reinforce the Pacific. A Pacific squadron could pivot toward Europe. Geography stopped being a barrier. The cost was immense. Between 1904 and 1914, more than 5,600 workers died during the American construction phase, many from disease and industrial accidents. Financially, the project consumed nearly $500 million at the time, the equivalent of well over $15 billion today, making it one of the most ambitious infrastructure investments in U.S. history. What the canal ultimately delivered was not just faster shipping, it delivered mobility, the defining ingredient of superpower status. It allowed the United States to maneuver naval forces across oceans during World War II, sustain operations in Asia, and project deterrence on 2 fronts simultaneously. In reshaping the map, the canal reshaped American power itself. By the mid-20th century, the Panama Canal was no longer just a strategic asset. It was a political liability. The Canal Zone, a U.S.-controlled enclave slicing through the center of Panama, looked less like cooperation and more like colonial rule. It operated with its own courts, its own police, and segregated communities. For many Panamanians, it was a daily reminder that sovereignty stopped at the edge of their own territory. The breaking point came in 1964. A dispute over flying the Panamanian flag inside the Canal Zone spiraled into riots. 22 Panamanians and 4 U.S. soldiers were killed. Diplomatic ties were severed. What had once been tolerated as geopolitical reality became combustible, and this unfolded in the middle of the Cold War. Across Latin America, anti-American sentiment was rising. The Cuban Revolution had already shown how quickly unrest could tilt towards Soviet influence. Washington faced a stark choice: maintain permanent control and inflame nationalist backlash, or recalibrate before resentment turned into strategic loss. In 1977, President Jimmy Carter and Panamanian leader Omar Torrijos signed the Torrijos-Carter Treaties. The Canal Zone would be dissolved. Full control would transfer to Panama on December 31, 1999. Critically, the canal was declared permanently neutral, open to all nations in peace and war, and the United States retained the right to defend that neutrality if threatened. This was not surrender. It was a calculated exchange. Washington traded territorial control for regional legitimacy. It removed a flashpoint Moscow could exploit and reinforced U.S. credibility in Latin America at the height of ideological rivalry. Under Cold War logic, the canal did not need to be American territory to serve American interests. It only needed to remain open, neutral, and secure. For decades, that assumption held. The canal functioned. U.S. ships moved freely. Panama remained stable. The transfer appeared strategically sound. But geopolitical stability is never permanent. The world that made relinquishing sovereignty rationale in 1977 is not the world Washington faces today. At first glance, the toll argument sounds straightforward. The United States is the canal's largest user. Roughly 13,000 ships transit the canal each year, and about 40% of U.S. container traffic moves through it. If fees are rising, Americans feel it in shipping costs, supply chains, and ultimately consumer prices. The canal generates between $2.5 and $3 billion annually for Panama. That revenue represents roughly 7 to 8% of the country's entire GDP. In other words, this is not just infrastructure for Panama. It is the backbone of its economy. So, why have tolls increased? The answer is far less political than it sounds. It is environmental. The Panama Canal depends on freshwater from Lake Gatun to operate its lock system. Every time a ship passes through, millions of gallons of freshwater are released into the sea. During the severe drought of 2023 to 2024, water levels dropped dramatically. At peak restriction, daily ship transits were reduced by as much as 40%. Fewer available transit slots, combined with steady global demand, meant one thing: prices went up. This was not a policy aimed at the United States. The toll increases were applied across the board to all nations. The canal operates under a neutrality framework established in the 1977 treaties, meaning preferential pricing for one country would raise legal and diplomatic challenges. And here is a crucial detail often overlooked in political rhetoric. Over the past 9 years, the U.S. Navy has paid roughly $17 million in canal transit fees. In the context of an annual U.S. defense budget exceeding $800 billion, and that amount is statistically negligible, a rounding error in Pentagon accounting. So, while the toll issue makes for effective political messaging, the numbers suggest something important. This is not fundamentally a dispute about money. If it were only about fees, it could be negotiated, subsidized, or absorbed without national drama. The scale simply does not justify the escalation, which means the argument about tolls is likely a surface layer, not the core of the concern. Strip away the rhetoric about tolls, and the center of gravity becomes clear. This is about China. In 2017, Panama severed diplomatic ties with Taiwan and formally recognized Beijing. Soon after, it joined China's Belt and Road Initiative, signaling deeper economic alignment. Since then, China has invested roughly $1.4 billion into Panamanian infrastructure projects, rapidly expanding its footprint in a country long considered firmly within the U.S. sphere of influence. Today, China is the second largest user of the Panama Canal, trailing only the United States. On its own, that fact is not alarming. Global trade flows where economics dictate. But in a world increasingly defined by strategic rivalry, commercial presence can evolve into geopolitical leverage. But the focal point of American concern is not the Canal Authority itself, which remains fully controlled by Panama, but the ports at either end of the canal. A Hong Kong-based company, CK Hutchison, operates major port facilities on both the Atlantic and Pacific entrances. These ports are not the canal's locks. They do not control passage, but they sit at both gateways of one of the world's most critical maritime corridors. In 2020, Beijing imposed the Hong Kong National Security Law, tightening its grip on the territory and blurring the line between Hong Kong-based firms and state influence. From a U.S. security perspective, that distinction matters. Could port data expose U.S. naval movements? Could submarine transits be tracked and shared? Could access be slowed or leveraged in a crisis? In peacetime, these concerns remain theoretical. In wartime, they become strategic variables. And in a scenario where tensions over Taiwan escalate, the Panama Canal is not just a trade route. It is a military artery. If even the perception emerges that China could influence, surveil, or disrupt that artery, it transforms the canal from infrastructure into a potential choke point. That is the core anxiety. Not that China owns the canal today, but that in a moment of great power conflict, it might be positioned close enough to matter. Everything sharpens when you look at Taiwan. In a Taiwan crisis, speed is not symbolic. It is decisive. Military power is measured in hours and days, not speeches. If war erupts in the Taiwan Strait, the United States must rapidly shift naval forces from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Carrier strike groups, submarines, logistics ships. America's fleet is split between two oceans. The Panama Canal cuts the transfer by roughly 16 days. In peacetime, 16 days is a statistic. In wartime, it can determine whether reinforcements arrive before a blockade tightens, before an amphibious assault secures ground, before deterrence collapses. The first phase of a great power war is measured in days. Delay changes outcomes. Now imagine the vulnerabilities. One deliberately grounded vessel in a narrow channel, as the world saw in Suez in 2021, could freeze traffic. Repeated low-cost drone strikes could disrupt operations without full-scale war. Port-side surveillance could map U.S. submarine movements before conflict even begins. Permanent control isn't required, only proximity, leverage, and timing. There is no evidence China runs the canal today. The Panama Canal Authority remains sovereign, but strategy is built on contingencies, not assurances. Capability matters as much as intent. If even a plausible scenario exists where American naval mobility could be delayed during a Taiwan crisis, planners must treat it as real. 16 days is not just transit time, it is strategic oxygen. And the anxiety in Washington is not that China owns the canal. It's that in the moment it matters most, America might discover that one of its most vital corridors can no longer be taken for granted. On paper, a U.S. invasion of Panama looks simple. Panama has no standing army. Its population is just 4.3 million. Its security forces are lightly armed. The United States would achieve air and naval dominance within hours. Control of the canal could be secured in days, but seizing territory is not the same as controlling it. The canal runs beside dense urban centers, including Panama City. Any prolonged U.S. presence would sit inside a sovereign nation whose citizens would see the operation not as stabilization, but occupation. That's where the strategy begins to unravel. An insurgency would be highly likely. Modern resistance does not require tanks or fighter jets, cheap drones, sabotage teams, cyber disruption. A small number of determined actors could repeatedly damage locks, ports, and transit routes. The canal would become a permanent security battlefield. The economic fallout would be immediate. If insurers classify the canal as a conflict zone, shipping premiums would surge or coverage could collapse entirely. Commercial traffic would reroute. The artery Washington sought to secure could choke under its own instability. Then comes the diplomatic shockwave. The United States positions itself as a defender of sovereignty and international order. A unilateral seizure, even under security justification, would fracture that narrative overnight. Comparisons to Russia's justification in Ukraine would be unavoidable. The reputational damage would ripple far beyond Latin America. And here's the deepest irony. Invading Panama to counter Chinese influence could push Panama decisively toward China. The very move meant to contain Beijing could strengthen it, militarily swift, strategically disastrous. Because controlling geography does not guarantee controlling consequences. And, in this case, the cure could destabilize far more than the threat ever would. At this point, the question is no longer whether retaking the canal would be costly. It's what Trump is actually trying to achieve, because the objective may not be as literal as it sounds. This could be a multi-layered strategic signal. First possibility, pressure. By raising the prospect of reclaiming the canal, Trump may be increasing leverage over Panama, pushing it to reduce Chinese influence, tighten oversight over port operators, or recalibrate its economic alignment. In negotiation theory, credible escalation expands bargaining power. The threat itself can be the tool. Second possibility, domestic positioning. The canal is a powerful symbol. It evokes American engineering dominance, global reach, and an era when U.S. power appeared unquestioned. Yet reframing its transfer as a historic mistake fits neatly into a broader narrative of restoring American strength. The rhetoric resonates emotionally, even if the policy remains ambiguous. Third possibility, contingency planning. If Washington increasingly views a U.S.-China confrontation over Taiwan as plausible within the next decade, then eliminating potential logistical vulnerabilities becomes part of long-term strategic thinking. In that context, raising the canal issue may be less about nostalgia and more about scenario planning. But there is a hard constraint that rhetoric cannot erase. Panama will never voluntarily surrender the canal again. It is central to its economy, its sovereignty, and its national identity. There is no realistic diplomatic pathway in which Panama agrees to reverse a treaty settlement that has defined its modern statehood, which leads to an unavoidable conclusion. If "take it back" is meant literally, the only mechanism available is force. And force, in this context, would trigger consequences far beyond the canal itself, destabilizing regional alliances, undermining U.S. credibility, and potentially strengthening the very rival the move was meant to contain. That is the strategic cliff edge. The most aggressive option is also the most dangerous. And whether Trump's statement is bargaining strategy, political messaging, or genuine intent, it raises a deeper question about how far the United States is willing to go to eliminate even the perception of vulnerability in a world defined by great power competition. The Panama Canal is not really about 1903. It's about the future. It's about whether the United States can guarantee its ability to project power across oceans in a potential conflict with China. It's about whether strategic anxiety, even the possibility of vulnerability, is enough to justify extraordinary action. This debate is not about who was right decades ago. It's about how far America is willing to go to eliminate a perceived weakness in an era of great power rivalry. And that raises the final question. How much risk is Washington prepared to accept to ensure it never loses control of its own mobility? If you found this breakdown useful, subscribe for deeper geopolitical analysis, and let me know in the comments. Is this strategic foresight or strategic overreach?